Bozeman Valley, Montana Territory, September 14th, 1878. The morning sun crept over the Bridger Mountains, painting the valley in shades of amber and gold. Frost still clung to the tall grass. The air carried that particular crispness that told every experienced settler the same hard truth. Winter was coming. And in Montana Territory, winter did not forgive the unprepared. Across the scattered homesteads of the valley, men and women moved with purpose, born of survival instinct. They split firewood until their shoulders burned. They chinked cabin walls with mud and straw, sealing every crack where cold might creep through. They counted their supplies, calculated their stores, and prayed they had enough to outlast the frozen months ahead. This was the rhythm of September in Montana. A race against time, a bet against nature. Everyone who had survived even one winter here understood the stakes. Those who didn't understand usually didn't survive to learn. But on a small plot of land at the eastern edge of the valley, one man was doing something that defied all logic. Something that made seasoned settlers stop their work and stare. Something that would become the most talked about foolishness in the history of Bozeman Valley. A stocky figure knelt in the dirt, driving his shovel into the earth with steady, methodical strokes. He was not digging a root cellar. He was not digging a well. He was not digging a foundation for a proper structure. He was excavating a trench, a long, snaking ditch that curved away from his half-built cabin in a lazy arc across his property, 4 feet deep, 200 feet long. And into this trench he was laying sections of clay drainage pipe, each piece 12 inches in diameter, carefully fitted and sealed with homemade mortar. His name was Eric Lindgren. He was 46 years old. He had arrived in Montana Territory 14 months earlier alone, carrying little more than a worn leather satchel and knowledge that no one in this valley possessed. He did not know it yet, but in exactly 82 days his strange project would save a man's life. A man who at this very moment was walking toward Eric's property with contempt in his eyes and mockery on his tongue. The story of the earth tube had begun. Eric Lindgren was not a man who invited conversation. He stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, built like a barrel with hands that showed decades of hard labor. His face was weathered by Scandinavian winters and American summers alike. Deep lines creased the corners of his eyes. His beard, once the color of wheat, now carried streaks of gray. He spoke English with a heavy Swedish accent, and he spoke it rarely. When neighbors greeted him, he would nod politely, offer a word or two, then return to his work. When they asked questions, he would answer in the shortest sentences possible. When they offered advice, he would listen without expression, then continue doing exactly what he had been doing before. This made him difficult to know. It also made him difficult to help. And in a frontier settlement where survival often depended on community cooperation, a man who kept to himself was a man who invited suspicion. The whispers had started within weeks of his arrival. He came alone. No wife, no children, no family of any kind. Where were they? Dead on the journey. Left behind in Sweden, the questions circulated through the settlement like smoke through a drafty cabin. He bought his land with cash, real money, not credit. Where did a Swedish immigrant get that kind of money? Some speculated he had robbed someone back east. Others guessed he had sold everything he owned in the old country. A few suggested darker possibilities that they only discussed in lowered voices. He started building his cabin in the wrong location. Every experienced settler knew you built on high ground away from the cold air that pooled in low spots during winter nights. Eric chose a site that was neither high nor low, apparently at random. When Josiah Blackwood pointed out the poor positioning, Eric had simply nodded and continued working. Now this, the trench, the pipes, the absolute madness of digging a channel that would connect the outside world directly to his living space. By the third day of digging, Eric Lindgren had become the primary subject of conversation at every gathering in Bozeman Valley. Josiah Blackwood was the first to confront him directly. Josiah was 53 years old and had been farming Montana land since 1872. 6 brutal winters had tested him. 6 brutal winters had taught him. He had watched men die from cold, from starvation, from the simple mistake of underestimating what this land could do to a human body. He had earned his authority. When Josiah Blackwood spoke about winter survival, people listened. When he warned a newcomer about danger-wise, newcomers paid attention. He stood at the edge of Eric's property on that third morning, arms crossed over his chest, watching the Swede fit another section of pipe into the trench. The September sun was warm on his back, but Josiah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He was watching a man dig his own grave. "Lindgren," he called out, "I need a word with you." Eric looked up. His face showed no surprise, no irritation, no particular interest. He simply waited, shovel in hand, for Josiah to continue. "I've been watching you work these past 3 days." Josiah walked closer, his boots crunching on the dry grass. "I've built 3 cabins in this valley, helped construct a dozen more. I've kept more than a few greenhorn families alive through their first Montana winter." He paused, waiting for some acknowledgement. Eric gave none. "What you're doing here," Josiah continued, gesturing at the trench, "I don't understand it. A pipe that runs from outside your cabin to inside your cabin. 200 feet of pipe buried in the ground. What exactly are you planning to drain? Because last I checked, water runs downhill, and that pipe of yours ends inside your living space." Eric wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. When he spoke, his accent was thick, his words carefully chosen. "It is not for water. Then what's it for? Air?" Josiah blinked. "Air? Yes. You're building a pipe to move air?" "Yes." Josiah stared at the trench, then at the pipe sections, then at Eric. The silence stretched between them. A crow called somewhere in the distance. The wind rustled through the grass. "Lindgren," Josiah said slowly, "do you understand what happens in Montana in January? Do you have any idea what the temperature does out here when the Canadian winds come down?" "I understand." "I don't think you do." Josiah's voice carried genuine concern beneath the frustration. "I've seen it hit 40 below zero. 40 below. Cold so deep your spit freezes before it hits the ground. Cold that kills horses standing in their stalls. Cold that turns a man's fingers black if he's outside without gloves for 10 minutes. He pointed at the trench. "And you're building a 12-inch highway that will pump that cold directly into your cabin. You're not just leaving a crack in the wall. You're installing a tunnel. A direct connection between the killing cold outside and the space where you're supposed to stay alive." Eric listened. His expression didn't change. "Every cabin in this valley is built on one principle. Josiah continued. Seal it tight. Stop every draft. Eliminate every gap where cold can enter and heat can escape. That's how you survive. That's how everyone survives. And you're doing the exact opposite. He waited for a response, an explanation, an argument, something. Eric picked up another section of pipe. Thank you for your concern. That was all. He turned back to his work, fitting the pipe into place, checking its alignment with a level. He had carved himself from a straight piece of pine. Josiah stood there for a long moment, watching, trying to find words that might penetrate whatever strange certainty had taken hold of this man's mind. But Eric was already spreading mortar on the joint, his movements precise and unhurried, as if Josiah had never spoken at all. Finally, Josiah shook his head and walked away. He had tried. He had done his duty as a neighbor. Whatever happened next was on the Swede's own head. But as he walked back toward his own homestead, Josiah could not shake the feeling that he was leaving a man to die. Word of Josiah's confrontation spread through the settlement within hours. By evening, half the valley knew about the Swedish immigrant and his mad construction project. By the next morning, the other half had heard as well. Augusta Brennan came to see for herself on the 5th day. Augusta was 44 years old and operated the most successful freight company connecting Bozeman to Fort Ellis. She had come west as a young bride, lost her husband to a logging accident in 1871, and had rebuilt her life through sheer force of will and business acumen. She knew construction. She had overseen the building of 2 freight warehouses and a stable that had withstood the weight of 3 feet of snow without so much as a cracked beam. She could calculate material costs to the penny. She could look at a structure and identify its weaknesses in seconds. When she arrived at Eric's property, she did not stand at the edge and call out. She walked directly to the trench, crouched down, and examined the pipework with a critical eye. Eric paused his digging and watched her. Augusta ran her fingers along a mortar joint. She tested the alignment of the pipes. She measured the trench depth with her forearm. Then she stood up, brushed dirt from her skirt, and looked Eric directly in the eyes. 4 days of labor so far by my count. Another 2 or 3 to finish at this pace. That's nearly a full week of work during the most critical preparation time of the year. Eric nodded. The pipe cost you what, $20, $22.50 for 200 feet of 12-inch clay drainage pipe. Augusta shook her head slowly. I could show you 6 better ways to spend that money and that time. A proper root cellar would cost less and actually serve a purpose. Additional firewood would cost less and actually keep you alive. Insulation materials, a better stove, winter clothing. Any of these would be more valuable than what you're building here. She gestured at the trench with something between fascination and dismay. I've studied engineering principles. I understand how air moves, how heat transfers. What you've built makes no sense from any perspective I can calculate. Eric said nothing. Airflow follows temperature differential. Augusta continued. Hot air rises, cold air sinks. Your intake is low, your outlet is low. There's no chimney effect, no draft, no reason for air to move through that pipe at all. It will just sit there cold and stagnant, creating a frozen mass under your cabin. She paused, her brow furrowed. Come February, you'll have permafrost forming under your floorboards. Ice will crystallize on your walls from the cold radiating up through the ground. That pipe won't just fail to help you. It will actively make your situation worse. Eric listened to every word. When she finished, he nodded once politely. "Thank you," he said. "You have thought about this carefully, and you disagree with my analysis. I wait for winter." Augusta studied him for a long moment. She had built her fortune by reading people, by understanding what drove them, by calculating their likely actions based on their stated intentions. Eric Lindgren was a blank wall. No tells, no reactions. Just that steady, patient certainty that seemed immune to logic or persuasion. "You're not a stupid man," she said finally. "I can see that in your work. The joinery is precise. The grade is consistent. You know what you're doing, technically speaking, which makes this even more confusing. Why would a careful craftsman build something so fundamentally flawed?" Eric picked up his shovel. "You will see." It was not a boast. It was not a challenge. It was simply a statement delivered with the same flat certainty as everything else he said. Augusta Brennan walked away that afternoon with a new puzzle occupying her mind. She did not believe Eric's pipe would work. The physics were wrong. The principles were wrong. Everything about it was wrong. But something in the man's absolute confidence made her wonder just for a moment if she might be missing something. She dismissed the thought by evening. She had not built a successful business by second-guessing sound engineering principles based on a stranger's stubborn silence. The Swede was a fool. The winter would prove it. Declan Gallagher was not a man who kept his opinions to himself. He was 45 years old, born in County Cork, Ireland, and had been building structures in the American West for 2 decades. 17 cabins bore his mark in the territory around Bozeman. He had survived 2 Colorado winters and 5 Montana seasons. He knew cold the way a sailor knows the sea. Intimately, respectfully, with full awareness of its power to kill. When he heard about the Swedish immigrant and his buried pipe, Declan laughed so hard he nearly choked on his whiskey. "A pipe," he wheezed to the men gathered at McAllister's trading post. "A bloody pipe running cold air straight into his cabin. I've heard some fool notions in my time, but this one takes the prize." He finished his drink, slammed the glass on the counter, and announced that he was going to see this madness for himself. He brought 3 other men with him. Witnesses, he called them. An audience for the confrontation he intended to deliver. They arrived at Eric's property on the afternoon of September 20th, 6 days into the excavation. The trench was nearly complete now, snaking across the landscape like a fresh scar on the earth. Eric was working on the intake structure at the far end, building a vertical pipe that rose 3 feet above ground level on a small rise. Declan stood at the edge of the property and shouted loud enough for half the valley to hear. "So this is it. This is the famous Swedish death trap I've been hearing about." Eric looked up from his work. The 4 men stood in a row, arms crossed, faces set in expressions of amused contempt. "I've built through cold you can't imagine," Declan announced, walking closer. "Spent a winter in a cabin at 9,000 feet elevation, where we burned through 8 cords of wood in 4 months, and still woke to frozen water buckets every morning. 8 cords. You know what 8 cords of wood looks like? It's a mountain. It's a forest stacked against your wall. And even with all that fuel, we were fighting for our lives every single day." He stopped at the edge of the trench and looked down at the pipe with theatrical disgust. The enemy is cold air infiltration. Every crack, every gap, every possible opening is a place where heat escapes and cold enters. This is not theory. This is not speculation. This is 20 years of building and surviving in conditions that would kill most men. He pointed at Eric, his finger jabbing the air. And you Swedish fool, you've installed a 12-inch highway for cold. You might as well leave your front door open all winter. Actually, no. That would be better. At least then you could close the door when you realized your mistake. This pipe is permanent. This pipe is built into the earth. When the cold comes through it like a river of death, you won't be able to stop it. The three men behind Declan nodded and murmured their agreement. Eric set down his tools. He stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his trousers. For the first time since any of them had known him, he walked toward his accusers instead of away from them. He stopped 3 feet from Declan Gallagher and met the Irishman's eyes directly. "You have built 17 cabins," Eric said quietly. Declan blinked, surprised by the direct engagement. "That's right. 17. More than anyone else in this valley." "All good cabins." "Damn right they are. Warm cabins. Safe cabins. Cabins that keep families alive." Declan puffed up with pride. "Every single one." Eric nodded slowly. "Then you are a good builder. You know what you know, and you know it well." Something in his tone made Declan hesitate. This was not the response he had expected. The Swede was supposed to defend himself, argue, make excuses. Instead, he was offering compliments. "But there are things you do not know," Eric continued. "Things no one in this valley knows, not because you are stupid, because you have never seen them." "What things?" Eric looked at the 4 men standing before him, looked at the trench behind him, looked at the mountains rising in the distance already dusted with the first snow of the coming season. "I wait for winter," he said. "Then you will see." Declan laughed, but there was less certainty in it now. "You wait for winter? That's your answer to everything, is it? Well, let me tell you what winter is going to show us Lindgren. It's going to show us a frozen pipe full of ice. It's going to show us a cabin that can't hold heat. And it's going to show us a Swedish corpse that I hope someone has the charity to bury before the spring thaw." He turned to his companions. "Remember this day, boys. Remember what this fool has built. Because come February, when we're hauling his body out of that cabin, I want you all to remember that we tried to warn him." The 4 men walked away, their laughter carrying across the empty field. Eric watched them go. His face showed nothing. No anger. No doubt. No fear. He returned to his work. The 4th critic arrived the next morning. Prudence Harlow was 32 years old and served as the settlement's school teacher. She had studied natural philosophy at a women's college in Ohio before coming west with her minister father. She was the closest thing Bozeman Valley had to a trained scientist. She came alone, carrying a small notebook and a pencil. Unlike the others, she did not stand at a distance or raise her voice. She walked directly to where Eric was fitting the final sections of pipe and sat down on a nearby stump. "Mr. Lindgren," she said, "I wonder if you would explain your project to me, not to argue, just to understand." Eric looked at her. She was the first person to approach him without condemnation already formed in their eyes. What do you want to know? Everything. She opened her notebook. The specifications, the reasoning, what you expect to happen when winter comes. For a long moment, Eric said nothing. He studied this young woman with her earnest expression and her pencil poised over blank paper. She reminded him just slightly of someone he had known long ago. Someone who had asked questions the same way. Someone who had believed that understanding could be found if only you looked hard enough. The pipe is 12 inches in diameter, he said finally. 200 feet long, buried 4 feet below the surface. The intake is there. He pointed to the rise. The outlet will be inside the cabin. Prudence wrote quickly. And the purpose? To bring air from outside to inside. She looked up. But that's exactly what Mr. Gallagher and the others are worried about. Cold air from outside entering your living space. The air will not be cold. Prudence frowned. Mr. Lindgren, I have studied thermodynamics at the collegiate level. Cold is the absence of heat. Heat moves from areas of high temperature to areas of low temperature. A pipe connecting the cold outside to the warm inside will conduct heat outward and cold inward. It's basic physics. Eric nodded. You are correct. About the physics. Then how can the air not be cold? Eric was silent for a long time. Prudence weighted her pencil still. What is the temperature of the ground? He asked finally. She blinked at the unexpected question. The ground, it varies. Cold in winter, warm in summer. At what depth? I'm not sure I understand. Eric knelt down and pressed his palm flat against the earth. Here. At the surface. Yes, it varies. Cold in winter. Warm in summer. But deeper. He pushed his fingers into the soil. 2 feet down, 3 feet, 4 feet. What is the temperature there? Prudence had no answer. The question had never occurred to her. Temperature was a surface phenomenon in her understanding. Air temperature, water temperature, the temperature of objects you could touch and measure. The deep earth was simply there, stable, unchanging. She had never considered that it might have a temperature distinct from the surface above it. I do not know, she admitted. 52 degrees, Eric said. Summer or winter, day or night. It does not change. 4 feet down, the earth holds 52 degrees always. Prudence wrote the number in her notebook, her mind already racing through implications. How do you know this? I measured. In Sweden. In Nebraska, where I stayed 2 years before coming here. Now here in Montana. Always the same. 4 feet down. 52 degrees. She looked at the trench with new eyes. 200 feet of pipe. 4 feet deep. Surrounded by earth that, if Eric was correct, maintained a constant temperature, regardless of the weather above. The air passes through the pipe, she said slowly, working through the logic. The pipe is surrounded by earth at 52 degrees. The air exchanges heat with the earth as it travels. Yes. So in winter, when outside air might be 20 below zero, the air in the pipe would be warmed by the earth. By the time it reaches your cabin, it would be closer to 52 degrees than 20 below. Yes. Prudence stared at her notebook. The numbers made sense. The physics looked at from this angle actually supported the design. rather than contradicting it. She had approached the problem with the wrong assumptions. They had all approached it with the wrong assumptions, but there was still a problem. Why would the air move? She asked. There's no pressure differential, no draft. The pipe is essentially horizontal. What forces the air through the system? Eric pointed to his half-built cabin. A second chimney, next to the wood stove. Not for smoke, for air. Hot air rises through that chimney, creates low pressure inside the cabin. Low pressure pulls air through the buried pipe. It was elegant, simple. A complete system that used basic physical principles that everyone understood, but no one had thought to combine in this way. Prudence closed her notebook slowly. This is remarkable, she said. Truly remarkable. Where did you learn this? Eric stood up. The brief openness in his expression closed like a door. Whatever had prompted him to explain his work to this young schoolteacher, the moment had passed. I wait for winter, he said. He walked back to his pipe and resumed working. Prudence sat on the stump for a long time, watching him turning over the implications in her mind. If he was right, he had found a way to dramatically reduce the fuel needed to heat a cabin in the brutal Montana winter. A way to use the earth itself as a source of warmth. But if he was right, why did no one else know about it? Why had she never read about this principle in any of her books? Why had experienced builders like Declan Gallagher, men who had spent decades surviving in cold climates, never discovered this themselves? She wanted to believe Eric. The logic was sound. The numbers worked, but 20 years of frontier experience said he was wrong. 4 experts who had kept families alive through Montana winters said he was wrong. The entire accumulated wisdom of the settlement said he was wrong. Prudence Harlow walked home that afternoon with doubt in her heart and questions in her mind that she could not answer. She would have to wait for winter. Like everyone else. 3 times in late September, neighbors came to Eric's cabin with genuine concern, trying to convince him to seal the pipe, to fill the trench with earth, to eliminate what they saw as a fatal flaw in his otherwise well-constructed home. Josiah Blackwood came on September 24th, bringing his wife Martha and a jar of preserved peaches as a gesture of goodwill. Lindgren, listen to me, he said, standing in the doorway of the half-finished cabin. I'm not here to mock you. I'm not here to say I told you so. I'm here because I don't want to watch another man die in this valley. Eric accepted the peaches with a polite nod. You've built a good cabin, Josiah continued. The logs are well chosen. The chinking is tight. The fireplace is properly constructed. You clearly know what you're doing when it comes to basic construction. Don't ruin it with this stubbornness. He pointed to the pipe outlet rising from the floor in the corner of the room. Just seal that pipe. Fill it with earth. We'll help you do it. 3 or 4 of us could have it done in a day. You'd lose the pipe cost, sure, but you'd have a cabin that might actually keep you alive. Eric looked at the pipe, looked at Josiah, looked at Martha, whose face showed the same earnest concern as her husband's. Thank you, he said. I'll wait for winter. Josiah threw up his hands. That's all you ever say. You wait for winter. Well, winter is gonna come, Lindgren. And when it does, you won't be able to wait anymore. You'll be fighting for your life. And that pipe will be killing you. And there won't be a damn thing any of us can do to help. He took his wife's arm, and walked away, shaking his head. Augusta Brennan came on September 27th, bringing a detailed sketch of a proper heating system she had designed based on stoves she had seen at Fort Ellis. "This would work," she said, spreading the paper on Eric's rough-hewn table. "A cast-iron stove with a proper heat exchanger. Pipes running through a water jacket to distribute warmth. I could get the materials shipped from Helena by early October. The total cost would be about $40, but it would cut your firewood consumption in half." Eric studied the drawing. It was clever work, thoughtfully designed. "This is a good system," he said. "Then let me help you build it. We can seal that pipe of yours and install something that will actually work." "My pipe will work." Augusta sighed. "Lindgren, I have calculated the heat transfer in that pipe. The numbers don't support your expectations. You're going to lose more heat through that opening than you'll ever gain from whatever you think is going to happen. Your calculations assume the Earth is the same temperature as the air." She paused. "What do you mean?" "At 4 feet depth, the Earth is 52 degrees. Always. Summer. Winter. It does not change." Augusta opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She had not considered that variable. Her calculations had assumed the Earth surrounding the pipe would be as cold as the winter air above it. But was Lindgren right? Was the deep Earth really a constant temperature? "I don't know if that's true," she admitted. "I measured. Even if it is true, the heat exchange rate might not be sufficient to warm the air significantly. The contact time as air moves through the pipe might be too short. The thermal conductivity of clay might not transfer enough heat from the Earth to the air." 200 feet of pipe, Eric said. 628 square feet of surface area. Air moves slowly. Plenty of contact time. Augusta stared at him. The man had done the math. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't hoping. He had calculated surface area, considered contact time, thought, through the thermal conductivity of his materials. Either he was a genius who had discovered something no one else knew, or he was a fool who had convinced himself his delusion was science. Augusta could not tell which. She gathered her drawings and left without another word. The third visit came on September 29th, the day before Eric completed his cabin. Declan Gallagher did not come to help. He came to deliver a warning. He stood in Eric's doorway with his arms crossed, his face set in hard lines, and spoke without preamble. "I've built 17 cabins in this territory. Every single one of them is still standing. Every single family I've built for has survived every winter since. That's not luck. That's not chance. That's knowledge, Lindgren. 20 years of learning what works and what kills." Eric listened. "I'm telling you right now, as clear as I can make it, that pipe is gonna kill you. When January comes and the temperature drops to 40 below, you're going to open that damper looking for some miracle, and instead, you're going to get a river of frozen death pouring into your cabin. Your fire won't be able to keep up. Your wood won't last. And by the time you realize your mistake, it'll be too late to fix it." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I've seen men die of cold, Lindgren. I've seen what it does to a body. The shivering that won't stop. The confusion that sets in when your brain starts to freeze. The blue lips, the stiff fingers, the eyes that stop seeing even while they're still open." Eric did not flinch. "I've seen a man freeze to death 3 feet from a stove because he couldn't remember how to put wood in the fire. That's what cold does. It takes your mind before it takes your life. And you've built a machine that will bring that coal directly into your home. Declan straightened up. I've said my piece. I've warned you fair and clear. When February comes and we're hauling your frozen corpse out of this cabin, I don't want anyone saying Declan Gallagher didn't try to save the Swedish fool. He turned to leave, then paused at the threshold. One last thing, Lindgren. How many cords of firewood have you put up for winter? 4. Declan laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. 4 cords. 4 cords for a Montana winter. A normal family needs 6 to 8 just to survive. And that's in a proper cabin without a 12-inch hole in the floor. He shook his head slowly. You haven't just built a pipe that leads cold into your home. You haven't put up enough fuel to fight it, even if you had a proper cabin. You're not just unprepared, Lindgren. You're planning to fail. He walked away, his voice carrying back across the empty yard. Come February, we'll be digging your grave. Mark my words. Come February, we'll be burying the Swedish fool who thought he knew better than 20 years of Montana winters. Eric stood in his doorway watching Declan disappear into the golden September afternoon. Then he turned back to his cabin. There was work to finish. September 30th, 1878. Eric Lindgren completed his cabin and his buried pipe system. The specifications were precise. 200 feet of 12-inch clay pipe running from a small rise on his property to the northeast corner of his cabin. 4 feet of depth consistently maintained along the entire length. A vertical intake structure at the rise extending 3 feet above ground level, capped with a simple wooden cover that kept out rain and snow while allowing air to enter through screened openings. Inside the cabin, the pipe emerged through the floor in the corner farthest from the wood stove. It rose 18 inches above the floorboards, topped with a wooden damper that could be opened or closed to control airflow. A second vertical pipe separate from the fireplace chimney extended through the roof near the stove. This was the exhaust designed to create the pressure differential that would draw air through the buried intake. The numbers told the story of the project. 600 cubic feet of earth, excavated by hand. 47 hours of labor spread across 16 days. $22.50 in pipe and materials. 300 pounds of mortar mixed from local clay, sand, and lime. 4 feet of depth. 12 inches of diameter. 200 feet of length. And one principle that Eric had learned from his grandfather in Sweden, refined through his own experiments in Nebraska, and now implemented in the harsh climate of Montana Territory. The earth at sufficient depth maintains a nearly constant temperature, regardless of conditions at the surface. It was not magic. It was not superstition. It was physics. Thermal mass and thermal inertia working on a scale that dwarfed any human construction. The earth absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. Surface temperature changes, even extreme ones, took months to penetrate to any significant depth. 4 feet down, the temperature reflected the average annual temperature of the region. For Bozeman Valley, that meant roughly 52 degrees Fahrenheit, summer or winter, day or night. In blazing August heat or January blizzards, 52 degrees as reliable as the sunrise, Eric's pipe created a heat exchanger using the earth itself as the thermal medium. In winter, cold air entering at 20 below zero would travel through 200 feet of pipe surrounded by earth at 52 degrees. The air would give up its cold to the warmer earth. The earth would give up its heat to the colder air. By the time that air emerged into the cabin, it would be substantially warmer. Not warm, not room temperature, but warmer by 70 degrees or more. Air that started at 20 below zero would emerge at something close to 50 degrees. Air that started at 40 below would emerge at something close to 45 degrees. This was the secret. This was what the critics had never considered. They saw the pipe and assumed it would bring cold air into the cabin because outside air was cold. They never asked what would happen to that air during its 200-foot journey through Earth that held a different temperature entirely. Eric knew. Eric had calculated. Eric had tested in root cellars and buried chambers in Sweden and Nebraska, measuring temperatures, observing results, refining his understanding until he was certain. The Earth was a battery, a massive thermal battery that never fully discharged. And Eric had built a system to tap that battery to draw warmth from the ground itself, to use the planet as a partner in survival, rather than treating it only as an enemy to be endured. On the last day of September, with his cabin complete and his system ready, Eric Lindgren stepped outside and looked across the valley. The aspens were turning gold. The first snow dusted the highest peaks. The air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. Somewhere across the settlement, Declan Gallagher was probably telling anyone who would listen about the Swedish fool and his death trap. Augusta Brennan was probably running calculations that told her Eric's system could not work. Josiah Blackwood was probably shaking his head and preparing to attend another funeral before spring. Eric did not mind. He did not need them to understand. Not yet. Winter would come. The cold would descend. And then they would see. They would all see. But there was one thing Eric had not told anyone. One piece of the story that he kept locked inside, buried even deeper than his pipe. Elsa. His sister's name was Elsa. She had been 8 years old in the winter of 1844. Eric had been 12. They had lived in a small village in southern Sweden in a cottage that their father had built with his own hands. That winter had been brutal. A cold snap had swept down from the north, dropping temperatures to levels that old-timers said they had never seen before. The family's wood supply ran low. The cottage walls, poorly chinked, leaked heat like a sieve. Eric remembered the night it happened. Remembered the cold that seeped through every crack. Remembered his mother wrapping Elsa in every blanket they owned, trying to keep her warm. Remembered his father burning furniture, then floorboards, then anything that would catch fire, desperately trying to maintain enough heat to keep his family alive. It wasn't enough. Elsa had started shivering in the early evening. By midnight, she had stopped. Eric remembered thinking that was a good sign. She had stopped shivering. She must be warming up. He learned later that when a body stops shivering, it means the body has given up trying to generate heat. It means the body is dying. Elsa was dead by morning, 8 years old. Frozen in her sleep while her family burned everything they had trying to save her. Eric's grandfather had arrived 3 days later after the cold snap broke. He had looked at the cottage, at the inadequate walls, at the empty woodpile. He had looked at the small grave behind the house where they had buried Elsa in frozen ground. And he had said something that Eric had never forgotten. The earth is warmer than the air in winter. If we had put Elsa underground, she would have lived. The earth would have kept her warm when we could not. It was a strange thing to say, but Eric's grandfather was a strange man. He built root cellars that never froze even in the deepest winter. He stored vegetables in underground chambers that maintained a perfect temperature year-round. He understood something about the relationship between earth and air that most people never considered. In the years that followed, Eric had worked alongside his grandfather, learning the secrets of earth temperature construction. He had measured soil temperatures at different depths. He had experimented with buried chambers and pipes. He had developed an understanding of thermal mass that no book had ever taught him. And he had made a promise, a silent promise to a sister who had died because her family did not know how to use the earth's warmth. He would never let cold kill someone he could save. The cabin in Montana was the fulfillment of that promise. The pipe was not just a heating system. It was a memorial. A monument to Elsa and to everyone who had ever frozen to death because they didn't know that warmth lay just 4 feet beneath their feet. When Josiah Blackwood said, "You will die alone in that cabin," Eric had wanted to tell him, had wanted to explain about Elsa, about his grandfather, about 42 years of learning and testing and preparing for this moment. But he had said only, "I will not die like that." He had said it with certainty because he had seen his sister die that way, because he had spent his entire adult life making sure he would never experience that helpless, frozen death. Because every calculation, every measurement, every section of carefully laid pipe was an answer to the worst night of his childhood. Eric Lindgren stood outside his cabin on the last evening of September 1878, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Winter was coming. He was ready, and somehow he believed Elsa was watching. October arrived with frost on the windows and ice on the water buckets. The valley settled into its preparation routine. Wood piles grew. Cabins were sealed. Families counted their supplies and calculated their chances. Eric Lindgren continued his work in silence. He reinforced his door. He installed thick shutters on his windows. He built a wooden floor with insulation packed beneath the boards. He stacked his 4 cords of firewood in a neat pile against the north wall of his cabin. 4 cords. Half what everyone said he needed. Less than half what prudent families put up. The whispers continued. The Swedish fool. The man who built a cold pipe and didn't store enough wood. The walking dead man who just didn't know he was dead yet. Declan Gallagher stopped mentioning Eric's name. There was nothing more to say. The Irishman had made his prediction. February would prove him right. Augusta Brennan still thought about the pipe, sometimes usually late at night when she was reviewing accounts, and her mind wandered to unsolved puzzles: earth temperature, thermal mass, heat exchange. The numbers almost worked if you accepted Eric's assumptions. But assumptions were dangerous things in the freight business. She had learned to trust only what she could verify with her own eyes. Josiah Blackwood had given up trying to help. He had done his duty as a neighbor. Whatever happened to Eric Lindgren was God's business now, not his. Prudence Harlow still had her notebook with the numbers Eric had shared. 52 degrees at 4 feet depth. She had not verified the claim, but she had not forgotten it either. Winter would provide an opportunity to test it if she could find a way to measure deep earth temperature. The days grew shorter. The nights grew longer. The temperature dropped degree by degree as October surrendered to November. And in his cabin at the edge of the valley, Eric Lindgren waited. He had waited 42 years for this winter. He could wait a few weeks more. On the morning of November 3rd, 1878, Eric opened the damper on his earth pipe for the first time. Cold November air, about 15 degrees above zero, entered the intake on the rise. It traveled through 200 feet of buried clay pipe. It emerged into his cabin at 54 degrees. Eric held his hand over the outlet. The air was cool compared to the warmth of the room, but it was not cold, not anywhere close to the freezing temperature outside. The system worked, but November was not the test. November was just the beginning. The real test would come later, when the temperatures dropped to 30 below, when the wind drove the cold through every crack in every cabin in the valley, when families burned through their wood and prayed for spring. Then everyone would see. Then everyone would understand. Eric closed the damper to a small opening, allowing a gentle flow of fresh air into the cabin. He fed a modest amount of wood into his stove. He settled into his chair and watched the fire burn. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall. Winter had arrived in Bozeman Valley. The months of waiting were over. Now came the months of proving. November brought the first true test of winter to Bozeman Valley. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees above zero on the morning of November 8th, 1878. Not dangerous cold, not killing cold, but cold enough to remind every settler what was coming. Cold enough to make fires burn hotter and wood piles shrink faster. Cold enough to separate the prepared from the hopeful. Across the valley, cabins roared with flame. Smoke rose from every chimney in thick gray columns. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding wood into hungry iron bellies, watching their carefully stacked supplies diminish one log at a time. This was the rhythm of Montana winter. Burn and replenish. Consume and conserve. A constant calculation of heat against cold fuel, against time survival, against the indifferent mathematics of thermodynamics. In his cabin at the edge of the settlement, Eric Lindgren sat in a chair by a modest fire, reading a Swedish Bible that had belonged to his grandfather. The stove glowed with gentle warmth, not the roaring inferno that blazed in other homes. His woodpile stacked against the north wall showed barely any reduction from its October height. And in the corner, the earth pipe outlet stood open, its wooden damper adjusted to allow a steady, gentle flow of air. The air coming through that pipe was 54 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 15. The earth had provided 39 degrees of free heating before that air ever reached the living space. Eric's cabin held at 65 degrees with half the fuel consumption of any other home in the valley. The system worked, exactly as he had calculated, exactly as he had promised. But November was not the test. Eric knew this. 15 degrees was uncomfortable. 15 degrees was challenging. 15 degrees was not the killing cold that would prove his system beyond all doubt. That cold was coming. He could feel it in his bones the way his grandfather had taught him to feel weather changes before they arrived. A pressure in the air, a stillness in the wind, the way animals moved with extra urgency as if they knew something humans had forgotten how to sense. The real test was coming, and when it arrived, Eric would be ready. Josiah Blackwood visited on November 12th, driven by a concern he could not quite name. He had watched Eric's cabin from a distance over the past week, watched the thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney, noticed how much smaller it was compared to the thick columns pouring from every other home. Wondered what it meant. Now he stood at Eric's door, stamping snow from his boots, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Lindgren, thought I'd check on you." Eric opened the door and stepped aside, inviting him in without words. Josiah entered and stopped 3 steps inside the cabin. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. The cabin was warm, not just survivable. Warm. Comfortable. The kind of warmth that made you want to take off your coat and settle into a chair. But the fire in the stove was small, modest, a fraction of what Josiah burned in his own cabin to achieve the same temperature. How? The word escaped before Josiah could stop it. Eric gestured toward the corner, the pipe outlet, the gentle flow of air emerging from that mysterious system. Josiah walked over and held his hand above the opening. Air moved against his palm. Cool air compared to the warmth of the room, but not cold. Not anything like the 15-degree air outside. He pulled out a small thermometer he carried in his coat pocket, a tool he used to monitor his own cabin temperature to know when to add wood, when to bank the fire for the night. He held it over the pipe outlet and watched the mercury settle. 54 degrees. Outside temperature 15 degrees. A difference of 39 degrees. Provided by what? The earth, the buried pipe. Josiah looked at Eric with new eyes. The Swedish fool. The man everyone said was building his own death trap. The immigrant who wouldn't listen to 20 years of frontier wisdom. "It's some kind of trick," Josiah said slowly. "You've got heat stored somewhere. A fire pit beneath the cabin. Something." Eric shook his head. "No trick. The earth is 52 degrees at 4 feet depth. The pipe brings air through that earth. The air warms. That's impossible." "You are holding the thermometer." Josiah looked at the instrument in his hand. 54 degrees. The numbers did not lie. The mercury did not deceive. But it made no sense. It contradicted everything he knew about cold and heat and survival. It contradicted 20 years of experience. It contradicted the basic understanding that outside air was cold and inside air was warm, and any connection between the two would drain heat from the living space. "I don't understand," Josiah admitted. The words cost him something. He was not a man who enjoyed admitting ignorance. Eric poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot warming on the stove. He handed one to Josiah and gestured toward a chair. "Sit. I will explain." For the next hour, Eric talked more than he had talked to anyone since arriving in Montana. He explained the principle of earth temperature stability. He described the measurements he had taken in Sweden and Nebraska here in Montana. He walked through the mathematics of heat exchange surface area contact time. Josiah listened. He did not understand everything. The science was beyond his education. But he understood enough. He understood that Eric had not built a death trap. He had built something revolutionary. Something that worked. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Josiah asked finally. "Why didn't you explain this from the beginning? We all thought you were crazy. We thought you were going to die." Eric was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. Would you have believed me? Josiah opened his mouth to say yes. Then he stopped, thought about it honestly, remembered his own certainty that the pipe was a mistake. Remembered Declan Gallagher's mockery. Remembered Augusta Brennan's calculations that proved the system couldn't work. No, he admitted. No, I wouldn't have believed you. So I wait for winter. I show. Showing is better than telling. Josiah finished his coffee and stood up. His mind was still processing what he had learned, still trying to reconcile the evidence of his senses with the assumptions he had carried for 2 decades. The others need to know about this, he said. Gallagher, Brennan, all of them. They need to see what you've built. Eric shook his head. Not yet. This cold is not the real test. 15 degrees is nothing. Wait for the deep cold. Wait for January. Then they will see. Then they will believe. Josiah nodded slowly. There was wisdom in that. The deeper the cold, the more dramatic the proof. And Declan Gallagher in particular would need dramatic proof to admit he had been wrong. I'll keep this to myself for now, Josiah said. But Lindgren, when the time comes, I want to be here. I want to watch you prove them all wrong. Eric smiled. It was the first time Josiah had ever seen him smile. You will be welcome. Josiah walked home that afternoon with his worldview quietly shifting. He had come to check on a fool and found a genius. He had come expecting to help a dying man and found a teacher. The Swedish immigrant knew something important, something that could change how people survived in this brutal climate. And in a few weeks, everyone would know it. November passed into December. The temperature dropped further. 20 degrees. 15. 10. The valley settled into the grinding routine of deep winter survival. Woodpiles shrank. Tempers frayed. Children grew restless, confined indoors by cold too bitter for play. Wives worried about supplies. Husbands worried about fuel. Everyone worried about the months still to come before spring. In other years, this would have been the hardest part. The psychological weight of knowing that the worst was still ahead. The mathematical reality that however much wood you had burned already, you would need to burn more. Much more. But this December brought a different kind of challenge. A test that would push the valley to its limits. A cold that would separate the living from the dead by margins measured in degrees and hours. It started on December 3rd, 1878. The morning dawned gray and still. No wind, no snow. Just a heavy silence that pressed down on the valley like a physical weight. Old-timers knew that silence. It was the quiet before a storm, the held breath before a scream. By noon, the first signs appeared. The temperature, which had held steady at 5 degrees above zero, began to drop. Not gradually. Not in the normal daily rhythm of warmer afternoons and colder nights. It dropped like a stone falling into a well. By 3 o'clock, the temperature had reached 10 below zero. By sunset, it had reached 20 below. By midnight, it had reached 30 below. And it kept falling. By dawn on December 4th, the mercury in thermometers across the valley had plunged to 38 degrees below zero. Wind chill drove the effective temperature past 50 below. The air itself seemed to crystallize. Breath froze in nostrils before it could be exhaled. Exposed skin went numb in seconds. This was not a normal cold snap. This was a killing freeze. The kind of cold that descended from the Canadian Arctic once or twice a decade, catching even experienced settlers off guard with its ferocity. And it showed no signs of breaking. The first day was survival. Across the valley, families fed their stoves with frantic urgency. Normal winter routine called for adding wood every few hours. This cold demanded constant feeding. Logs that would normally burn for an hour were consumed in 30 minutes. Stoves that normally glowed a comfortable orange burned a desperate red. Josiah Blackwood woke on that first morning to find frost on the inside of his windows. Not condensation, frost. Ice crystals forming on the interior surface of glass that was supposed to separate the warm inside from the cold outside. He checked his thermometer. The cabin had dropped to 48 degrees overnight, despite a fire that never went out. More wood, he told his wife, Martha. We need more wood. He had started the winter with 7 cords. Good planning by any standard. More than enough for a normal Montana winter. But this was not normal. And 7 cords might not be enough. His daughter Anna, 8 years old, sat by the stove wrapped in every blanket they owned. Her breath still formed small clouds in the air. The cabin should have been warm enough to prevent that. The cabin was failing. Josiah spent that first day carrying wood from the pile, splitting frozen logs that resisted the axe feeding the insatiable stove. By evening, his arms ached and his back screamed protest. He had burned through a quarter cord in a single day. At that rate, his 7 cords would last 28 days. The winter had 3 more months to go. The mathematics were brutal. The mathematics might be fatal. Augusta Brennan faced her own crisis in the freight warehouse she had converted to living quarters. The building was large, too large. She had chosen it for space for storage for the comfort of not feeling cramped during the long winter months. Now that space was killing her. Heat rose to the high ceiling and dissipated before it could warm the living area. The large windows which provided such pleasant light in summer leaked cold like open wounds. The wooden walls designed for storing cargo, not sheltering people, offered inadequate insulation against the killing freeze. By noon on December 4th, the warehouse interior had dropped to 31 degrees. Ice was forming on the water buckets. Breath condensed and froze on every surface. Augusta's 2 brothers, Heinrich and Wilhelm, worked in rotation to keep the stove burning. One chopped wood. One carried it inside. One fed the fire. They rotated every 2 hours trying to maintain the brutal pace the cold demanded. It was not enough. We need to move to the back office, Augusta announced on the evening of the first day. Smaller space, easier to heat. The office was cramped. 3 adults in a room meant for 1. But cramped was survivable. The warehouse was not. They spent that night huddled around a smaller stove in the smaller space burning furniture to supplement their dwindling wood supply. A chair first, then a small table, then a wooden crate that had once held expensive shipping records. We are burning our business, Heinrich said quietly. We are burning to stay alive, Augusta replied. The business means nothing if we're dead. Prudence Harlow sat in the schoolhouse, which had been converted to emergency housing, when the regular teachers' quarters proved inadequate to the cold. 3 other families had joined her there, pooling their resources, their firewood, their body heat. The schoolhouse was better insulated than most cabins built to keep children comfortable during lessons. But even good insulation had limits. Even thick walls could not stop cold that extreme. Prudence thought about Eric Lindgren's pipe as she watched the temperature drop inside the building. 52 degrees at 4 feet depth, he had said. The earth holds 52 degrees always. If he was right, his cabin was the warmest place in the valley right now. The safest place. The only place where survival did not depend on burning enough wood fast enough to outrace the cold. She wished she had believed him. She wished she had studied his system more carefully. She wished she had built her own version before the freeze arrived. But wishes did not warm cabins. Only fire did that. And fire required wood. She added another log to the schoolhouse stove and prayed the supply would last. The second day was worse. The temperature rose slightly to 32 below. It felt almost like a reprieve, almost like the cold was breaking. It was not breaking. It was gathering strength. By evening, the mercury had dropped again. 35 below. 37. 38. The same brutal cold as the day before, with one crucial difference. Everyone had 24 fewer hours of firewood. Josiah Blackwood's cabin had stabilized at 42 degrees. Survivable but miserable. His stove glowed red with constant burning, but the cold leaked through walls, through floor, through the frost-covered windows faster than the fire could compensate. Martha had developed a persistent cough. The cold air irritated her lungs every time she breathed. She slept sitting up, wrapped in blankets, trying to minimize the frigid air entering her chest. Anna had stopped complaining. She sat by the stove in silence, her eyes dull, her energy conserved for the basic task of staying warm. She was a child who should have been playing, laughing, driving her parents to distraction with endless questions. Now she sat like a small statue, waiting for the cold to end. That night, Josiah woke to the sound of crying. Anna's blankets, the blankets closest to the wall, had developed frost from her own breath. The condensation from her exhalations had frozen on the wool, creating a layer of ice that pressed against her face. She was crying because her blankets were frozen. Josiah moved her closer to the stove, wrapped her in fresh coverings, held her until she stopped shaking. His own hands were numb by the time she fell back asleep. 42 degrees inside, 38 below zero outside, and the cold showed no sign of breaking. The third day brought the first real casualties. Old man Hendricks, 73 years old, was found dead in his cabin by neighbors who had come to check on him. His stove was cold. His woodpile was empty. He had burned through his entire supply in 2 days and had frozen in his sleep sometime during the night. The neighbors couldn't bury him. The ground was frozen solid to 4 feet deep. They wrapped his body in canvas and stored it in an outbuilding until spring. 2 horses died at the Peterson farm. They had frozen standing in their stalls, unable to generate enough body heat to survive, even with the shelter of the barn. 3 cattle died at the Morrison Ranch. Same cause. The animals' natural insulation, sufficient for normal winters, could not protect against cold this extreme. And at cabins across the valley, families began to face an impossible calculation. If the cold continued at this rate, firewood supplies would not last. If firewood supplies did not last, people would begin to freeze. If people began to freeze, there would be no help. Everyone was fighting the same battle. No one had resources to spare. The mathematics of survival had turned into the mathematics of death. Declan Gallagher faced his own mathematics in a cabin that had once been his pride. He had built it himself 3 years earlier, using every technique he had learned in 20 years of cold weather construction. Double thick walls on the north side, triple chinking in every gap. A fireplace and a stove, 2 heat sources instead of 1. The finest cabin in the valley, he had often boasted. The warmest, the tightest, the most weatherproof. He had been wrong about the location. The cabin sat in a low spot, a gentle depression in the landscape that seemed harmless in summer and autumn. But in winter, cold air pooled in low spots, the way water pooled in valleys. It was simple physics. Cold air was denser than warm air. It sank. It collected. It concentrated. Declan's masterpiece of construction sat in a bowl of cold that was even more brutal than the surrounding terrain. His thermometer, which had read temperatures as high as 65 degrees in normal winters, now struggled to reach 34. 34 degrees. Inside a cabin with double walls and triple chinking and 2 heat sources burning simultaneously. The cold was winning. Declan had started the winter with 5 cords of firewood. It should have been enough. His superior construction meant lower fuel consumption. That was the theory. That was what 20 years of experience had taught him. But 20 years of experience had not prepared him for this cold. 20 years of experience had not prepared him for a low spot that amplified the freeze. 20 years of experience had not prepared him for mathematics that turned deadly. By the evening of December 6th, the 4th day of the freeze, Declan had burned through 3.5 cords. He had less than 2 cords remaining. At his current consumption rate, that supply would last 5 days. The cold showed no sign of breaking. His wife, Bridget, watched him with worried eyes as he returned from the woodpile with another armload of logs. She had seen the measurements. She understood the numbers. She knew what was coming if the weather did not change. "We need to get more wood," she said quietly so their voice wouldn't carry to the neighbors who might hear weakness. From where? Declan's voice was flat, exhausted. "Everyone is burning through their supplies. No one has extra. And even if someone did who would sell firewood in the middle of this freeze, it would be selling their own survival. Then we need to find another solution, another heat source, something." Declan laughed bitterly. "There is no other solution. Fire is the only thing that fights cold. Fire requires fuel. Fuel is running out. That's the equation. That's all there is." He threw the logs into the wood box with more force than necessary. "I've built 17 cabins," he said. 17. And every single one of them is better than this. Every single one is warmer than this because I built them in better locations. I knew better. I've always known better. And I built my own cabin in the one spot in this valley where cold collects like water in a bucket." His voice cracked on the last word. "I'm gonna die in the best-built cabin in the territory because I put it in the wrong place. And there's nothing I can do about it." Bridget moved to his side, took his cold hands in hers. "We're not dead yet," she said firmly. "As long as we're breathing, we're fighting. And as long as we're fighting, there's hope." Declan looked at his wife, at the woman who had followed him from Colorado to Montana, who had believed in him when others doubted, who had shared his triumphs and his failures without complaint. "I don't know if hope is enough this time," he whispered. The fifth day of the freeze arrived with no change in temperature and no change in the mathematics of death. 38 below zero, 5 days running. Wind chill past 50 below. And across the valley, wood piles that had seemed adequate a week earlier were now critical. Josiah Blackwood had burned through half his winter supply. At his current rate, he would run out by late January. Still dangerous, but survivable if the cold broke soon and normal winter resumed. Augusta Brennan had burned through 2/3 of her supply, supplemented by furniture and business records. She had perhaps 3 weeks of fuel remaining, maybe less. The Schoolhouse Collective had pooled resources from 4 families, creating a larger supply, but also a larger demand. Their mathematics came out roughly even with Josiah's. Late January was the cliff edge. But Declan Gallagher's mathematics had turned fatal. He woke on the morning of December 7th to find his cabin at 31 degrees. The stove was still burning. Both fireplaces were still burning. Every heat source was operating at maximum. But the cold in the low spot was overwhelming everything. His water bucket had frozen solid overnight. His breath formed thick clouds that hung in the air before slowly dissipating. His fingers, even inside the cabin, had turned white at the tips. And his woodpile had less than 1.5 cords remaining. 1.5 cords. At his current consumption rate, 3 days of fuel. Maybe 4 if he cut back burning, but cutting back. Burning meant letting the cabin temperature drop further. Drop too far, and they would never recover the heat. The cold would win. The cabin would become a freezer, and they would die in their beds, just like old man Hendricks. Declan tried to think clearly, but the cold was affecting his mind. Hypothermia did that. It crept into the brain, slowed reactions, confused thoughts. By the time you realized you were in danger, you were often too far gone to help yourself. He was shivering constantly now. Had been shivering for 2 days. His body was working overtime to generate heat-burning calories he couldn't afford to lose, fighting a battle it could not win. Declan. Bridget's voice came from somewhere that seemed far away. Declan, you need to eat something. He looked at the bowl of stew she was offering. Hot food. Calories. Fuel for the internal fire that kept a human body alive. But eating required effort, required moving, required thinking. And all of those things required energy he did not have. I'm fine, he mumbled. Just need to rest a minute. You've been resting for 2 hours. You're not fine, you're freezing. Declan looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Not from cold, from something worse. The fine tremors of a body losing its battle against temperature drop. When had that started? He couldn't remember. Come closer to the fire, Bridget urged. Please, Declan. You're scaring me. He tried to stand and found his legs wouldn't cooperate. They felt distant, disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. Can't, he said. Legs won't work. Bridget's face went pale. She had seen this before. In Colorado, during their first winter, she had watched a neighbor lose his feet to frostbite after a hunting accident left him exposed to cold for too long. The same sequence. First the trembling, then the weakness, then the numbness that spread upward from the extremities. Her husband was dying. We need help, she said. We need to get you somewhere warmer. Nowhere warmer. Declan's words were slurring now. This is the best cabin in the valley. I built it. I know. It's not keeping you warm enough. Nothing could keep warm enough. Cold is too strong. Cold always wins eventually. Bridget grabbed his shoulders and shook him hard. Listen to me, Declan Gallagher. You are not dying in this cabin. Do you hear me? You are not leaving me alone in this frozen hellscape because you were too proud to ask for help. Something in her voice cut through the fog in his brain. Pride. She had said pride. Was he dying of pride? Help from where? He mumbled. And suddenly, Bridget knew the answer. The Swedish fool. The man with the buried pipe. The man everyone had mocked. The man Declan had mocked louder than anyone. If Eric Lindgren's system worked, his cabin would be the warmest place in the valley. If his system worked, he would have heat to spare. If his system worked, he might be the only person who could save her husband's life. And if his system didn't work, he would be just as frozen as everyone else, and they would be no worse off than before. Can you walk at all? Bridget asked. Maybe with help. Then get up. We're going. Going where? Bridget wrapped blankets around her husband's shoulders, pulled a wool cap down over his ears, wrapped his frozen hands in extra cloth. To the only place that might still be warm, she said. To Eric Lindgren's cabin. Declan's eyes widened slightly. The Swede. The man with the death pipe. The man with the only chance of saving your life. She pulled him to his feet. He swayed, nearly fell, caught himself on the doorframe. I told him he was going to die, Declan whispered. I told him we'd be digging his grave by February. Then let's hope he's a forgiving man. Bridget opened the door and the cold hit them like a physical blow. 38 below zero. Wind chill past 50 below. The distance to Eric Lindgren's cabin was perhaps 400 meters. It might as well have been 400 miles. But there was no choice. Stay in the cabin and Declan would die within hours. Walk into the cold and he might die faster. But he also might reach warmth in time. Certainty of death versus possibility of survival. Bridget chose possibility. She wrapped her arm around her husband's waist and stepped into the killing freeze. The journey was a nightmare measured in footsteps. Bridget counted them because counting gave her something to focus on other than the cold that burned her face and the weight of her husband's body and the fear that closed around her heart like a frozen fist. 1, 2, 3, 4. Declan stumbled on the 5th step. She caught him. They kept moving. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. His weight was increasing, not because he was getting heavier, because his legs were getting weaker. He was leaning on her more with every step, his own strength fading as his core temperature dropped. 20 steps, 30, 40. Halfway there, a quarter, she couldn't tell. The world had narrowed to the path directly in front of her feet. The weight on her shoulder, the count in her head. 50, 51, 52. Declan stopped walking. Can't, he breathed. Too tired. Just leave me here. No. Bridget, please. You can make it without me dragging you down. I said no. She grabbed his arm and pulled it over her shoulder. Took more of his weight. Kept walking. 60 steps. 70. 80. Her own legs were burning now. The cold cut through her clothes like they weren't there. Her lungs ached from breathing air so frigid it crystallized inside her chest. 100 steps. She looked up and saw Eric Lindgren's cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin white column. Light glowed behind the frost-covered windows. Close, so close. 120 steps. 130. Declan had stopped responding to her voice. His feet were dragging now, not walking, leaving twin furrows in the snow behind them. His head had dropped forward onto his chest. He was unconscious, or dying. She couldn't tell which. 150 steps. The cabin door was right there. 15 feet away. 10. 5. Bridget reached out with her free hand and knocked. Pounded. Slammed her frozen fist against the wooden surface with every ounce of strength remaining in her exhausted body. The door opened, and warmth hit her like sunlight. Eric Lindgren stood in the doorway, his face showing surprise for the first time since anyone had known him. Behind him, the cabin glowed with comfortable heat. Not the desperate, roaring heat of a fire fighting a losing battle. Steady heat. Gentle heat. The kind of heat that came from a system working properly, effortlessly, naturally. Bridget didn't try to explain. Didn't ask permission. Didn't waste breath on words. She dragged her unconscious husband through the door and collapsed on the floor beside him. "Please," she gasped. "Help him. Please." Eric didn't hesitate. He lifted Declan with a strength that belied his stocky frame and carried him toward the stove, settled him in a chair, wrapped him in blankets that had been warming near the fire. Bridget watched through a haze of exhaustion as Eric worked. He removed Declan's frozen outer clothes, wrapped his hands and feet in warm cloth, held a cup of hot water to his lips, letting a few drops trickle into his mouth. The cabin was warm. That was the thought that kept circling through Bridget's foggy mind. The cabin was warm. Truly warm. 68 degrees, maybe 70. Warmer than any cabin in the valley. Warmer than anywhere she had been in 5 days. And the fire was small, modest. Nothing like the roaring infernos burning in every other home. How? She looked around the room trying to understand, trying to find the secret. And her eyes fell on the pipe in the corner. The buried pipe. The death trap. The foolish project that every expert had mocked. It was open. Air was flowing through it. Cool air compared to the warmth of the room, but not cold. Not freezing. Not the killing breath of the Montana winter. The pipe worked. Declan had been wrong. Everyone had been wrong. And that wrong might have cost him his life. "He is hypothermic," Eric said, his voice calm and steady. "But not too far gone. His body is still fighting. If we keep him warm, he will live. Thank you." Bridget's voice broke on the words. "Thank you. I didn't know where else to go. I didn't know what else to do." Eric paused in his ministrations and looked at her with those steady, unreadable eyes. "You did the right thing," he said. "You came to where it was warm. That is always the right thing." He returned to his work, adjusting blankets, adding a hot stone wrapped in cloth to warm Declan's core. Bridget sat on the floor, too exhausted to move, too grateful to speak. Her husband was going to live. The man he had mocked was saving his life. And outside, the cold continued to howl, killing everything it touched. Everything except the warmth in this cabin. Everything except the heat from the earth itself. 2 hours passed. Declan's color slowly returned. His breathing steadied. His hands, which had been waxy white, flushed pink as circulation restored. His eyes opened again. Awareness crept back into his expression. He was sitting in a chair in a warm cabin. His wife was beside him holding his hand. A man was offering him a bowl of hot soup. The man was Eric Lindgren. Declan stared at him for a long moment, trying to reconcile reality with memory, trying to understand how he had gotten here. What had happened, why the Swedish fool was feeding him soup instead of freezing in his own death trap. "Where am I?" he asked. His voice was rough, his throat raw. "My cabin," Eric said. Declan looked around. The warmth registered first, then the modest fire, then the pipe in the corner open and flowing with air that should have been lethal cold but somehow wasn't. The pipe worked. How? The question escaped before Declan could stop it. "The earth is 52 degrees, Eric said simply, "at 4 feet depth, summer or winter. The pipe brings air through the earth. The air warms." Declan shook his head slowly. "I told you it wouldn't work. I told everyone it wouldn't work. You were wrong, I know." Declan looked at his hands wrapped in warm cloth, still tingling with returning sensation. "I know I was wrong. I've been wrong about a lot of things, it seems." He met Eric's eyes directly. "You saved my life. I came to your door half dead, and you saved me. After everything I said about you, after every insult, every mockery, every prediction of your death." Eric handed him the soup bowl. "Eat. You need strength." "Why?" Declan asked. "Why help me? I gave you every reason to let me freeze." Eric was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind howled past the cabin, the sound muffled by good construction and steady warmth. "When I was 12 years old," he said finally, "I watched my sister die of cold. She was 8. Her name was Elsa. We did not have enough heat. We did not know about the Earth's warmth. We did not know that survival lay just 4 feet beneath our feet." His voice was steady, but something ancient and terrible moved beneath the words. "I promised myself that day that I would never let cold kill someone I could save. I would learn. I would build. I would find a way." He looked at Declan with those steady eyes. "You are not my enemy. Cold is my enemy. Cold is everyone's enemy. And tonight, cold is losing." Declan felt something shift in his chest. Not just physical warmth returning. Something else. Something like shame and something like admiration and something like the beginning of understanding. "I owe you my life," he said quietly. "You owe me nothing. This is what neighbors do." "Not all neighbors. Not after what I said." Eric shrugged. "Words are air. Actions are earth. Tonight you are warm. Tomorrow you will be alive. That is what matters." Declan drank his soup slowly, feeling the heat spread through his body, feeling strength return to limbs that had been dying just hours before. Outside, the cold that had nearly killed him continued to rage, but inside, the earth's warmth held steady, and Declan Gallagher began to understand that everything he thought he knew about survival was about to change. The cold broke on December 9th, 1878. It did not retreat gracefully. It did not fade in gentle degrees like autumn surrendering to winter. It shattered. One moment the valley lay frozen under 38 below zero. The air itself crystallized into a weapon. The next moment, warm winds swept down from the mountains and the temperature climbed 20 degrees in 6 hours. By noon, the mercury had risen to 0. By evening, it had reached 12 above. By the following morning, the valley had returned to something resembling normal winter. Normal winter. The phrase seemed absurd now. A week earlier, normal winter had felt brutal, challenging, dangerous. Now it felt like mercy, like a gift. Like the earth itself had decided to stop trying to kill everyone and return to merely testing them. But the damage was already done. The 6-day freeze had left scars across Bozeman Valley that would take months to heal. Some of those scars would never heal at all. 4 families had burned through their entire winter wood supply. The Hendersons, the Mullers, the Carsons, and the Whitfields had all reached the bottom of their wood piles during the freeze, feeding their stoves with furniture, with fence posts, with anything that would burn. They now faced the remaining months of winter with no fuel and no money to buy more at the inflated prices that scarcity had created. 7 people had developed respiratory infections from breathing frigid air for nearly a week. Martha Blackwood's cough had settled into her chest and showed no signs of improving. 3 children at the schoolhouse collective were bedridden with fever. Old Mrs. Patterson, 71 years old, had developed pneumonia and was not expected to survive the month. And Declan Gallagher, the master builder who had constructed 17 cabins and had opinions about everything, had come within hours of freezing to death in his own home. The valley had survived, but survival and victory were not the same thing. In the days following the freeze, people began to take stock. They counted their remaining wood. They calculated their remaining supplies. They looked at the calendar and counted the weeks until spring. And they talked. They talked about the cold, about the losses, about the narrow escapes. They talked about old man Hendricks, whose body still lay wrapped in canvas in an outbuilding waiting for spring thaw to allow burial. They talked about the Henderson family who had been taken in by neighbors and were now living 4 families to a cabin built for 1. But most of all, they talked about Eric Lindgren, the Swedish fool, the man with the buried pipe, the immigrant who wouldn't listen to 20 years of frontier wisdom, the man whose cabin had maintained 68 degrees throughout the freeze while everyone else had fought for survival. Word of Declan's rescue had spread through the valley within hours of the cold breaking. Bridget had told the story to anyone who would listen. Her husband, half dead from hypothermia, carried through 400 meters of killing freeze, saved by the warmth of a cabin that should have been the coldest in the territory. The man Declan had mocked had saved his life. The system everyone had dismissed as madness had worked perfectly. Now everyone wanted to know how. Josiah Blackwood arrived at Eric's cabin on the morning of December 11th. He came alone carrying a leather satchel that held his thermometer, a notebook, and a pencil. He came without pride, without assumptions, without any of the certainty that had characterized his previous visits. He came to learn. Eric opened the door and regarded his visitor with those steady, unreadable eyes. If he felt any satisfaction at the reversal, any pleasure at being proven right, his expression revealed nothing. "Mr. Blackwood." "Lindgren." Josiah removed his hat and held it in both hands. "I need to understand what you've built here. Not to argue, not to criticize. I need to understand because I nearly lost my family during the freeze, and I think you might have found something that could save lives." He paused, swallowing his pride with visible effort. "I was wrong about your system. I told you it was a death trap. I told you the cold would come through that pipe and kill you. I was wrong, and I'm man enough to admit it." Eric nodded slowly. "Come inside." For the next 2 hours, Josiah received the education of his life. They started at the intake structure on the rise 200 feet from the cabin. The cold snap had broken, but the temperature was still 22 degrees above zero. Cold enough to see breath. Cold enough to feel the bite of winter on exposed skin. Eric removed the wooden cap from the intake pipe. Cold air whistled down into the earth, beginning its 200-foot journey. "The air enters here," Eric said. 22 degrees. It travels through the pipe surrounded by earth at 52 degrees. The air is colder than the earth. Heat moves from warm to cold. The earth warms the air. They walked the length of the buried system. Eric pointed out the landmarks, explaining where the pipe ran, how deep it lay, how the grade had been maintained to prevent water accumulation. 4 feet deep, he said. Always 4 feet. Above the frost line is not deep enough. The temperature varies too much. Below 4 feet costs more digging for little benefit. 4 feet is the balance point. Back inside the cabin, Eric opened the damper on the outlet pipe. Air flowed into the room, gentle and steady. Josiah held his thermometer over the outlet. He watched the mercury rise, settle, stabilize. 54 degrees. Outside air temperature, 22 degrees. A difference of 32 degrees, provided entirely by the earth. 32 degrees of free heating, Josiah said, slowly the implications unfolding in his mind. Every cubic foot of air that enters this cabin arrives 32 degrees warmer than outside. No wood burned, no fuel consumed. Just the earth doing the work. Yes. During the freeze, when it was 38 below zero, how warm was the air from the pipe? I measured 49 degrees. Josiah did the math in his head. 38 below zero to 49 above. A difference of 87 degrees. Free. Automatic. Constant. That's why your cabin was so warm. That's why you burned so little wood. The earth was doing most of the heating for you. Yes. Josiah sat down heavily in the chair Eric offered. His mind was reeling. 20 years of frontier experience. 6 Montana winters. 3 cabins built with his own hands. And he had never once considered that the earth itself could be used as a heat source. "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you figure this out? This isn't in any book I've ever read. This isn't something anyone around here has ever tried." Eric was quiet for a long moment. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one to Josiah, settled into his own chair. "My grandfather," he said finally, "in Sweden. He built root cellars that never froze even in the coldest winters. He stored vegetables in underground chambers that stayed cool in summer. and warm in winter. He understood that the earth holds its temperature, that it doesn't change with the air above. He taught you this system. He taught me the principle. The rest I learned myself. Measuring, testing, trying different depths, different pipe lengths. In Sweden first, then in Nebraska, then here. How long did it take to figure out all the specifications? Eric smiled slightly. The first smile Josiah had ever seen from him. 42 years. Since I was 4 years old watching my grandfather measure temperatures in his root cellar. A lifetime of learning. Josiah looked around the cabin. At the modest stove, the small fire, the comfortable temperature. At the pipe in the corner delivering earth-warmed air in a gentle, constant flow. 42 years of learning, compressed into 200 feet of buried clay pipe. A system so simple that anyone could build it, yet so revolutionary that no one in Montana had ever conceived of it. The others need to know, Josiah said. Gallagher, Brennan, everyone. If we'd had this system, the freeze might not have been so devastating. People might not have burned through all their wood. Hendricks might not have died. I know. Will you teach them? Show them what you've shown me. Eric set down his coffee cup. I came to this valley 14 months ago. I built my system in silence because I knew no one would believe words. They needed to see. They needed evidence they could measure with their own thermometers, feel with their own hands. He looked at Josiah directly. Now they have evidence. Now they will listen. Yes, I will teach anyone who wants to learn. Then let's start today. Let's bring people here, let them see for themselves. Eric nodded. Bring them. I will show them everything. The procession began that afternoon. Josiah returned to the settlement and spread the word. Within hours, a steady stream of visitors began making their way to Eric Lindgren's cabin. Augusta Brennan came first, bringing her brothers and her surveyor's measuring tape. She measured everything. Pipe length, pipe diameter, trench depth, inlet and outlet temperatures, air velocity at various damper settings. Her practical mind, the same mind that had calculated why the system couldn't work, now calculated exactly how and why it did work. The economics are compelling, she announced after 2 hours of measurements. $22.50 in pipe cost versus 20 to 30% reduction in wood consumption. The system pays for itself in 4 winters, then generates pure savings every year after. She paused, her eyes moving to the pipe outlet. But the real value isn't money. During the freeze, when wood prices doubled and people were burning furniture, your system kept you independent. You weren't dependent on supply. You weren't vulnerable to shortage. That's worth more than any calculation can capture. Prudence Harlow came with her notebook asking detailed questions about the physics. The heat transfer mechanisms, the relationship between pipe length and temperature gain. The surface area is the key, Eric explained. 200 feet of 12-inch pipe provides 628 square feet of interior surface where air contacts the pipe walls. The pipe walls conduct heat from the surrounding earth. More length means more surface area means more heat exchange. Why 12-inch diameter? Why not larger or smaller? Larger diameter requires more excavation for the same length. The increased air volume doesn't improve heat exchange proportionally. Smaller diameter restricts airflow, creates resistance, reduces the system's capacity. 12 inches is the balance point. Prudence wrote everything down. Her earlier skepticism transformed into fascination. The science was elegant. The application was practical. The results were measurable and reproducible. This should be documented, she said. Written down properly with all the specifications so others can build their own systems. This knowledge is too valuable to exist only in one man's head. Then write it down, Eric said. You have the education. You understand the principles. Write it so others can learn. It was the beginning of what would become the first practical guide to earth-coupled heating in the American West. Declan Gallagher came on December 14th. He walked slowly still, recovering from his brush with death. His face was pale, his movements careful, his usual bluster entirely absent. He came alone without the entourage that had accompanied his previous visit, without the mockery that had characterized his earlier pronouncements. He stood at the threshold of Eric's cabin, hat in hand, and could not seem to find words. Eric waited. I owe you my life, Declan finally said. I've been trying to figure out how to say that properly for 3 days. I've been trying to find words that express what it means to have a man save you, after you spent months telling everyone he was a fool. He shook his head slowly. I can't find those words. I don't think they exist. Come inside, Eric said. They sat by the stove, two men who had been adversaries now bound by something more complicated than friendship or enmity. You were right, Declan said. About everything. The system works. The earth holds its temperature. The pipe pre-warms the air. Every single thing you said was true. And every single thing I said was wrong. You said what your experience taught you. 20 years of building, 20 years of surviving. You weren't lying. You were wrong, but you weren't lying. Is there a difference? Of course. A liar knows the truth and hides it. You believed what you said. You were trying to help me in your way, trying to save me from what you thought was a fatal mistake. Declan stared at the floor. I called you a fool, a Swedish death wish. I told people you'd be dead by February. Words are air. You dragged yourself 400 meters through killing cold to reach my door. That is action. That is what I remember. Declan looked up, confusion in his eyes. I didn't drag myself. Bridget dragged me. I was half dead by then. You walked as far as you could. Then your wife carried you the rest. Together you reached warmth. That took courage. That took trust. That took faith that there might be something better waiting at the end of the journey. He poured coffee for both of them. You came to my door because you had no other choice. You stayed to learn because you had the humility to admit you were wrong. The second thing is harder than the first. Declan took the coffee with hands that still trembled slightly. Teach me, he said quietly. Teach me how to build what you've built. Not just for myself, for everyone I've ever built for. 17 cabins and not one of them has what yours has. I want to fix that. Eric studied him for a long moment. Building is not the hard part. The hard part is believing it will work. You've already done the hard part. Then show me the easy part. For the next 3 hours, Eric walked Declan through every aspect of the system. The specifications, the materials, the construction techniques, the calculations for different cabin sizes. The master builder who had mocked the Swedish immigrant became the student. The immigrant who had worked in silence became the teacher. By the time Declan left that afternoon, he had pages of notes, a head full of new knowledge, and a heart full of something that might have been gratitude, or might have been shame, or might have been the beginning of wisdom. Whatever it was, it would change how he built for the rest of his life. Word spread beyond Bozeman Valley. By Christmas week, 17 families had formally requested information about Eric's earth tube system. Some came in person, making the journey from distant homesteads to see the miracle cabin for themselves. Others sent letters asking for written instructions, offering to pay for the knowledge. Eric refused all payment. "This is not for sale," he told anyone who offered money. "This is for sharing. The earth's warmth belongs to everyone. I cannot sell what I do not own." He drew diagrams, explained specifications, helped calculate dimensions for different cabin sizes and different soil conditions. He answered questions with patient detail, never condescending, never impatient, never holding back information. The critical numbers were simple enough that anyone could remember them. 4 feet depth, 12-inch diameter, 3 feet of pipe per square foot of cabin floor space. For a 200-square-foot cabin, 600 feet of pipe. For a 400-square-foot cabin, 1,200 feet. The construction process was straightforward. Dig the trench, level the bottom, lay the pipe with consistent grade, seal the joints with clay mortar, surround with gravel for drainage, backfill with excavated earth, install intake on high ground, install outlet in far corner from stove, add exhaust chimney near heat source. Any man who could build a cabin could build an earth tube system. The materials were available. The labor was manageable. The benefits were measurable in cords of wood not burned in warmth, maintained during the coldest nights. By January 23, families had either started construction or made firm plans to install systems before the next winter. By February, that number had grown to 31. The innovation was spreading, not through advertising or promotion, through demonstrated results, through measured temperatures, through the simple evidence of cabins that stayed warm when others froze. People started calling it different names. The earth tube system, the Lindgren pipe, the Swedish heater. Eric didn't care about names. He cared that people weren't freezing. Every cabin he helped design was a small victory against the cold that had taken Elsa 44 years earlier. Every family he advised was a promise kept to a sister who had died too young. The community members who installed earth tube systems began to innovate. Jacob Miller, a German immigrant who had been skeptical during the freeze, but was convinced by the evidence afterward, added a second exhaust chimney to create stronger airflow. His system showed slightly better performance. Air temperature at the outlet measured 56 degrees instead of 54, suggesting the increased flow improved heat exchange. Emma Richardson, a widow managing her homestead alone, installed a shorter system, only 100 feet at 5 feet depth. Her system worked but showed less temperature gain. The measurements validated Eric's specifications. Longer pipe provided more heat exchange surface area. The improvement was linear with length. 2 brothers, William and Patrick O'Connor, who operated a sawmill at the edge of the settlement, built an ambitious version using 2 parallel pipes, one for intake, one for exhaust. The entire system ran underground, circulating air through the earth continuously. Their temperature measurements showed the exhaust pipe delivered air at 51 degrees, cooling it from room temperature down toward earth temperature. The system worked as a complete heat exchanger. Incoming air warmed, outgoing air cooled. Both exchanges happened underground, invisible, and automatic. The fuel savings data accumulated through the winter of 1878 to 79. Families with earth tube systems burned an average of 43% less wood compared to their previous winter consumption. Augusta Brennan tracked her own results with accounting precision. 4.2 cords consumed versus 7.1 the previous winter, a 41% reduction. Josiah Blackwood reported similar numbers, 4.8 cords versus 7.6, a 37% reduction. The savings were consistent, measurable, economically significant, but the numbers told only part of the story. The settlement's doctor, Marcus Webb, noticed another effect. Families with earth tube systems had lower rates of respiratory illness. The constant fresh air circulation prevented the stuffiness and air quality problems common in tightly sealed cabins. The pre-warmed air meant people weren't breathing deeply cold air even when ventilating. Respiratory infections dropped by an estimated 30% in homes with the system. Dr. Webb started actively recommending installation to families with children or elderly members. Women reported another benefit. The reduced heating load meant less time feeding fires through the night, better sleep, more energy for other tasks. Sarah Miller documented that she spent 4 hours less per week on fire management after their earth tube installation. 4 hours per week, multiplied across 40 families. Over 6,000 hours of labor freed annually for more productive use. The earth tube system wasn't just a heating innovation. It was a quality of life improvement that rippled outward in ways no one had anticipated. The winter of 1878 to 79 passed into memory. Spring arrived with its usual muddy chaos. The ground thawed. Old Man Hendricks was finally buried in the cemetery on the hill. Life resumed its normal rhythms, but Bozeman Valley had changed. The settlement that had mocked Lars for burying pipe under his cabin had learned something profound. Traditional wisdom wasn't always complete. New ideas that seemed absurd often seemed that way because they operated on principles the critics didn't understand. And the immigrant who said little but worked steadily might know something that generations of American frontier experience had overlooked. Eric's success changed how the community approached innovation. Future, unusual building techniques were given more consideration, tested, more fairly judged on results rather than theory. 3 families experimented with passive solar designs, angling windows to capture winter sunlight. 2 tested wind power for pumping water. 1 built an elaborate rainwater collection system that neighbors initially called foolish, but became standard practice after a dry summer proved its value. The earth tube principle extended beyond heating. Farmers started using the same concept for root cellars and food storage, running buried pipes to create consistent cooling year-round. The O'Connor brothers at the sawmill installed an earth tube system to pre-cool summer air entering their workspace, reducing the brutal heat that had made August work nearly unbearable. A brewery 60 miles south in Virginia City heard about the innovation and installed earth tubes to maintain consistent fermentation temperatures without ice. The concept, once proven, found applications across multiple industries. Eric Lindgren lived quietly through the following years. He never married, never had children, never sought recognition for his innovation or profit from his knowledge. He lived in his cabin with the buried pipe system, tending a small garden in summer, reading his Swedish Bible in winter, helping neighbors when they asked and leaving them alone when they didn't. He watched the settlement grow around him, watched his earth tube system spread through the valley and beyond, watched families stay warm in winters that would have killed their grandparents. He thought about Elsa sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, wondered if she could see what he had built, what he had accomplished, what he had learned from her death. Wondered if she was proud of the brother who had spent his life fighting the cold that had taken her. He never spoke of her to anyone except once late one evening in the winter of 1886, when Josiah Blackwood visited with a bottle of whiskey and memories of the Great Freeze 8 years earlier. "Why did you come to Montana?" Josiah asked. "Why here of all the places in the world?" Eric stared into the fire for a long time. "The coldest place I could find," he said finally. "If my system could work here, it could work anywhere. I needed to prove it in the worst conditions possible. Prove it to who everyone already believes you. Prove it to myself. Prove it to Elsa." It was the first time Josiah had heard the name. "Who is Elsa?" "My sister. She died when I was 12. Froze to death in our cottage in Sweden. I watched her die because we didn't know what I know now. The fire crackled. The wind moaned outside. The earth tube delivered its steady flow of warmed air." "I'm sorry," Josiah said. "Don't be sorry. Be warm." That's what she would have wanted. That's what I've spent my whole life making possible. They finished the whiskey in silence, two old men watching the fire, thinking about the dead who had shaped their lives. Eric Lindgren died on March 8th, 1893. He was 61 years old. The cause was pneumonia, a bitter irony for a man who had dedicated his life to keeping people warm. The infection had started as a simple cold caught during a late winter trip to Helena for supplies. By the time he returned to Bozeman, the cold had settled into his lungs. Within 2 weeks, he was bedridden. Within 3, he was gone. The funeral was the largest the valley had ever seen. Over 200 people attended, many traveling considerable distances through late winter snow to pay their respects. Josiah Blackwood gave the eulogy, his voice breaking as he described the man who had saved Declan Gallagher's life, revolutionized heating in the territory, and never asked for anything in return. Augusta Brennan read from the documentation that Prudence Harlow had compiled years earlier. The technical specifications that had allowed hundreds of families to build their own earth tube systems. Declan Gallagher, older, now his once black hair turned gray, stood at the graveside and wept openly. He had never fully repaid the debt he owed. Now he never would. They buried Eric on the small rise at the edge of his property, the same rise where the intake for his earth tube system stood, the same rise where 45 years earlier, his grandfather had taught him the principles that had shaped his entire life. His headstone bore a simple inscription: Eric Lindgren, 1832 to 1893. The earth holds its warmth. The cabin with the buried pipe system was sold to a young couple from Wisconsin. They lived in it for 12 years, raising 3 children in warmth maintained by a system they never fully understood, but learned to appreciate. After them came another family, then another, generation after generation, living in the cabin Eric had built, warmed by the earth tube that continued to function year after year with minimal maintenance. The clay pipes held. The mortar joints stayed sealed. The earth continued to provide its 52 degrees of constant temperature, summer and winter, decade after decade. The cabin stood until 1947, 69 years after Eric had laid the first section of pipe. It was finally demolished that spring to make way for a modern house with electric heating and proper insulation. The new owners had no use for an ancient earth tube system. They filled in the trench, removed the intake structure, sealed the outlet in the floor. Progress, they called it. Within a generation, almost no one remembered that the system had ever existed. The forgetting happened gradually, then suddenly. By the 1920s, fossil fuel heating had become cheap and widely available. Coal furnaces replaced wood stoves. Oil heating systems replaced coal. The brutal economics that had once made earth tube systems essential no longer applied. Why dig 200 feet of trench when you could simply burn more coal? Why build a complex system when fuel was abundant and inexpensive? The economic calculation had shifted, and with it the relevance of Eric Lindgren's innovation. Families stopped installing new systems. Existing systems fell into disrepair. The knowledge that had once spread like wildfire through the Montana settlements began to fade from memory. The Great Depression scattered families across the country. Communities that had preserved traditional knowledge were broken apart by economic devastation. Young people left for cities. Old people died with their knowledge unrecorded. World War II accelerated the forgetting. Energy became a strategic resource controlled and distributed by governments and corporations. Individual self-sufficiency gave way to dependence on centralized systems. By 1950, almost no physical evidence remained of the earth tube revolution that had transformed Montana settlements 70 years earlier. A few academic papers mentioned the concept in passing. A handful of regional histories noted that settlers had experimented with earth-coupled heating, but no one connected these scattered references to the comprehensive system that Eric Lindgren had developed. The knowledge hadn't been suppressed. It had simply been forgotten, rendered irrelevant by cheap energy, lost in the shuffle of progress. Eric Lindgren's life work had vanished from human memory. Then came the energy crisis of 1973, the oil embargo that October sent gasoline prices soaring and heating costs through the roof. Suddenly, the cheap energy that had made earth tube systems irrelevant was no longer cheap. Families that had heated their homes without thinking about cost were suddenly calculating every gallon, every degree, every dollar. Scientists and engineers who had spent their careers assuming abundant energy began searching for alternatives. Passive systems, renewable sources, anything that could reduce dependence on expensive, unreliable fossil fuels. At the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado, a team of researchers began investigating earth-coupled ventilation systems. They had found references in old agricultural journals to underground cooling systems used for food storage. They wondered if the same principle could be applied to heating and cooling buildings. They ran experiments, measured temperatures, calculated heat transfer rates, and they discovered exactly what Eric Lindgren had known almost a century earlier. At 4 feet depth, Earth temperature remains at 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round, varying by less than 5 degrees. pipes buried at that depth will consistently warm incoming cold air in winter and cool incoming hot air in summer. The system requires no energy input, has no moving parts, and will function reliably for decades. The researchers published their findings to considerable excitement. They had discovered a revolutionary passive heating technology, a system that could dramatically reduce energy consumption with minimal cost and maintenance. They gave it a name: Earth-Air Heat Exchanger, Ground-Coupled Ventilation System, Geothermal Preconditioning. They filed patents, wrote papers, gave presentations at conferences. Not one of them knew that a Swedish immigrant in Montana had built a fully functional version of their revolutionary system in 1878. Not one of them knew that the principle had been widely adopted throughout the American frontier, then forgotten. Not one of them knew about Eric Lindgren. The earth tube system was reinvented, rediscovered, celebrated as a breakthrough, and the man who had first proven it in the killing cold of a Montana winter remained unknown. His contribution to human comfort and survival lost to history. There is a photograph that survives. It was taken in the spring of 1891, 2 years before Eric's death. A traveling photographer had passed through Bozeman Valley offering portraits for $1 apiece. The photograph shows Eric standing in front of his cabin. He is 59 years old. His beard is more gray than blonde now. His shoulders are slightly stooped, but his eyes are the same, steady, patient, knowing something that the viewer cannot quite grasp. Behind him, just visible at the edge of the frame, the intake structure of his earth tube system rises from the small hill. The pipe that changed everything. The innovation that saved lives and then vanished from memory. The photograph passed through several hands over the decades. A historical society acquired it in 1982. A researcher cataloging frontier images noted the unusual structure in the background, but could not identify its purpose. The photograph sits now in an archive in Helena, Montana, labeled simply Unidentified Settler Bozeman Valley circa 1890. No one who looks at it knows they are seeing the face of a man who fought a war against cold and won. No one knows they are seeing the last physical evidence of a revolution that was erased by progress. The earth still holds its warmth. 4 feet beneath the surface in Montana and Sweden and everywhere across the temperate world, the ground maintains its steady 52 degrees, summer and winter, day and night. Through wars and depressions and energy crises and all the chaos of human history, the principle Eric Lindgren understood has not changed. The physics he mastered have not been altered. The system he built could be replicated today with the same specifications, the same materials, the same results. Modern building codes in several northern states now recognize earth-coupled ventilation systems as legitimate passive heating strategies. New homes are being built with versions of the same technology Eric developed. Architects speak of geothermal preconditioning as if it were a recent innovation. Perhaps it is. Perhaps every generation must rediscover what previous generations knew. Perhaps knowledge like heat can only be preserved if someone is willing to maintain the system that holds it. Eric Lindgren is gone. His cabin is gone. His earth tube system has been filled in and forgotten. Even his grave has been lost. The headstone toppled by a storm in 1932 and never replaced. But the principle endures. The earth holds its warmth. Always has. Always will. And somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind howls and the cold presses against windows, and the furnace works overtime to maintain comfort, there might be a moment to remember. To remember a Swedish immigrant who came to Montana with nothing but knowledge. To remember a system that seemed like madness until it saved lives. To remember a man who never sought fame, never sought fortune, never sought anything except to keep the cold from killing the people he could help. Eric Lindgren watched his sister die at 12 years old. He spent the next 49 years learning how to prevent that death from happening to anyone else. He succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. And then he was forgotten. That is the tragedy of innovation. The solutions we develop often outlive the memory of those who develop them. The benefits we create are absorbed so completely into daily life that no one remembers a time when those benefits didn't exist. We flip a switch and light appears. We turn a dial and heat flows. We forget that someone had to discover these principles. Someone had to prove they worked. Someone had to fight against mockery and doubt and the crushing weight of conventional wisdom. Eric Lindgren was that someone, at least for the people of Bozeman Valley in 1878. He fought the cold. He won. And then the world moved on. But here's the thing about forgotten knowledge. It can be remembered. This story you have just heard is an act of remembering. Every time it is told, Eric Lindgren lives again. Every time someone learns about the Earth tube system, his innovation is rediscovered. Every time a person understands that the Earth holds its warmth at 4 feet depth, they carry a piece of knowledge that Eric carried, that his grandfather carried, that generations of humans have understood and forgotten and understood again. Knowledge does not die. It sleeps. And stories are the alarm clocks that wake it. December 3rd, 1878. 38 degrees below zero. A killing freeze that lasted 6 days. In cabins across Bozeman Valley, families burned through their wood supplies, froze in their beds, watched their children shiver, and their elders weaken. In one cabin at the edge of the valley, a Swedish immigrant sat by a modest fire in a room that held 68 degrees. The earth warmed his air. The system he had built worked exactly as he had designed it. And when Declan Gallagher arrived at his door, half dead from cold, Eric Lindgren did not hesitate. He opened the door. He let the warmth pour out. He saved a man who had called him a fool, because that is what the Earth tube was for. Not for pride, not for profit, not for proving anyone wrong, for keeping people warm, for fighting cold, for honoring the memory of a sister who had died too young. Elsa Lindgren never saw her brother's triumph. She died at 8 years old in a Swedish winter before Eric understood what the earth could offer. But every family that stayed warm because of Eric's system was a tribute to her. Every child that did not freeze was a victory over the cold that had taken her. Every innovation that built on his principle carried a piece of her forward into the future. The earth holds its warmth. So does memory, if we choose to tend it. Eric Lindgren, 1832 to 1893. The Swedish madman who was not mad at all. The immigrant who knew something no one else understood. The man who fought the cold and won. Remember him. Remember what he built. Remember why he built it. And the next time you are warm in a cold world, take a moment to think about the people who made that warmth possible. The innovators, the believers, the stubborn fools who turned out to be right. They are the reason we survive. They are the reason we thrive. They are the earth tubes that carry warmth from generation to generation, hidden beneath the surface, working silently, keeping the cold at bay. Honor them, remember them, and never ever call a new idea foolish just because you don't understand how it works. The Swedish madman might be right. The Swedish madman is almost always right.